For 5 centuries, millions of people have stood in that quiet refectory in Milan and looked up at 30 feet of crumbling plaster, convinced they were looking at nothing more than a picture of a dinner. What if that was never the whole truth? What if the most examined painting on the planet had been quietly waiting for a mind patient enough and strange enough to finally read it properly? Before we get into what happened inside a small research lab outside Turin last year, make sure you're subscribed, because this story only gets stranger from here. Leonardo da Vinci was a man who trusted almost no one with his real thoughts. Anyone who has flipped through reproductions of his notebooks knows the feeling of looking at pages that seem to resist you on purpose. The backward lettering, the private shorthand, the diagrams that fold in on themselves like locks with no visible keyhole. Historians have offered the tidy explanation for decades. He was left-handed, and writing right to left kept his hand from smudging the ink. It's a reasonable answer. It's also, according to a growing number of scholars, an incomplete one. Leonardo lived in a world where the wrong idea, spoken to the wrong person, could end a life. He watched from a distance as freethinkers of his era paid brutal prices for saying what they believed out loud. A man that careful, that observant, does not merely stumble into secrecy. He builds it deliberately, the way he built his machines and his anatomical studies, piece by piece, so that only the right eyes, at the right moment in time, would ever be able to open it. That's the premise a small, half-forgotten research group decided to test again. Their target was the Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498 on the north wall of the dining hall at Santa Maria del Grazie. Everyone who has ever studied Renaissance art knows the story of its physical failure. Leonardo abandoned the traditional fresco method, where pigment is worked directly into wet plaster and becomes chemically part of the wall. He wanted more control than that technique allowed, more room to blend color slowly and build the subtle transitions in skin and cloth that made his figures breathe. So he painted onto dry plaster instead, using a mix of tempera and oil that let him work like an easel painter on a wall the size of a barn door. It was audacious. It was also, in the long run, a disaster. Paint applied this way never truly bonds with stone the way fresco does, and within Leonardo's own lifetime, witnesses were already describing flaking and discoloration, humidity from the kitchen next door, centuries of candle smoke, a stretch of the building used as a horse stable by Napoleonic troops, and finally Allied bombing in 1943 that took out the roof and left the wall protected only by sandbags stacked in front of it by chance and by prayer. What survives today is less an original painting than the ghost of one, rebuilt through generations of restoration work. That instability is exactly what caught the attention of a materials scientist named Elena Kovac. She wasn't an art historian by training. Her background was in imaging systems for structural failure analysis, the kind of work usually reserved for bridges and aircraft fuselages, not Renaissance masterpieces. But a conversation with a conservator friend in Milan planted an idea she couldn't shake. Because Leonardo built the painting in layers on dry plaster rather than fusing pigment into wet stone, anything sketched, scored, or written into an early layer and then painted over would, in theory, still be sitting there physically, buried under everything that came after. Not lost, just unreachable by ordinary sight. The problem was that people had already looked. Between 1978 and 1999, The Last Supper underwent the most exhaustive restoration project in its history. 21 years of work stripping away centuries of overpainting and grime to get back to whatever remained of Leonardo's own hand. During that process, conservators used infrared reflectography and X-ray fluorescence to map under drawings, the loose charcoal sketches Leonardo used to plan his composition before committing to paint. Those scans revealed real secrets, changed poses, adjusted hand positions, an entire arm that Leonardo repositioned partway through, but nothing resembling a hidden text. In 2007, a separate Italian survey pushed further, producing a digital capture of the wall at a resolution north of 16 billion pixels, alongside hyperspectral data, recording how the surface reflected light across dozens of wavelengths invisible to the human eye. All of that data was archived. All of it sat mostly untouched for over a decade, because nobody had a method for asking it the right question. Kovac's idea was simple to describe and difficult to execute. Don't build a model that looks for pictures. Build one that learns Leonardo, the specific rhythm of his hand, the particular way his backward letters curved and connected, the geometry buried inside his sketches, and then let that model loose on the old hyperspectral archive to see if it noticed anything a human eye, or a simpler piece of software, would have dismissed as noise. She pitched the project twice before anyone funded it. The first review board called it speculative, to the point of being unscientific. The second, smaller and more willing to gamble on a strange idea, gave her 18 months and a modest grant, mostly because one of the reviewers happened to have a background in paleography and found the underlying logic sound even if the odds of success seemed remote. The team she assembled was small. Herself, a machine learning engineer named Daniel Ferreira, who had spent years working on handwriting recognition for historical archives, and a conservation specialist, Isabel Connie, who had actually worked on the wall itself during a later touch-up campaign in the 2000s and knew its physical quirks better than almost anyone alive. They trained their model first on a huge corpus of Leonardo's own writing, thousands of pages pulled from the Codex Atlanticus, the Codex Arundel, and the anatomical notebooks held in Windsor, teaching it to recognize the specific pressure, spacing, and curvature of his hand in both his mirrored script and his occasional forward writing. Only after that foundation was built did they load in the old hyperspectral captures of the painting itself and ask the system to flag anything statistically inconsistent with random material degradation. The early weeks were brutal, in the ordinary way that most real research is brutal. The system returned page after page of nothing. Cracks, salt efflorescence, patches where earlier restorers had used slightly different pigment mixtures that showed up as noise under certain wavelengths. Day after day, the outputs were reclassified and thrown out. By the end of the second week, Ferreira was only half joking when he suggested they'd built an extremely expensive way to catalog wall damage. Conti, who had touched this plaster with her own hands years earlier, was quieter about her doubts, but no less skeptical. Kovac kept running the jobs anyway, partly out of stubbornness and partly because canceling the project felt, to her, like giving up on a question she still genuinely didn't know the answer to. On day 16, something shifted, though not dramatically enough to feel like a breakthrough. The model flagged a narrow band of plaster low on the wall, behind and slightly to the left of the figure of Bartholomew, as anomalous, with a confidence score of just over 60%. It wasn't proof of anything. 60% is barely better than a coin flip when you're deciding whether centuries-old plaster damage is actually intentional human marking. But it was the first flag in over 2 weeks that didn't collapse under closer inspection, and Kovac spent that night alone in the lab, running the same section through every filter the system had, trying to break the result instead of confirm it. It held. She brought Conti in early the next morning before Ferreira arrived. Connie's first instinct was the same one any conservators would be. This looks like efflorescence, mineral salts drawn up through the wall by moisture over centuries, crystallizing on the surface in patterns that can look deceptively deliberate to an untrained eye. It's an extremely common phenomenon in old plaster buildings across northern Italy, and Connie had seen it hundreds of times in other structures. She wasn't dismissing the finding out of stubbornness. She was applying the most boring, most statistically likely explanation first, which is exactly what good conservation science demands. But when they overlaid the flagged shapes against samples of Leonardo's mirror script pulled from the training set, something nagged at both of them. Salt deposits tend to spread in organic, branching patterns, following the physics of crystallization rather than the rhythm of a hand moving across a surface. What the model had flagged had a different quality. Consistent spacing, small connective strokes between clusters, a kind of controlled irregularity that felt more like handwriting trying to look accidental than actual accident. Connie didn't change her position that day. She simply agreed it was worth pulling additional sections, rather than closing the question on the first data point. Over the following 3 days, they widened the search considerably, feeding the model every remaining hyperspectral tile from the 2007 survey, not just the areas near Bartholomew. What came back changed the tone in the room. Similar flagged shapes began appearing in isolated pockets near the figure of James the Greater, in the folds of drapery near Philip, and in a thin band running along the base of the tablecloth beneath Christ's hands. None of these locations were adjacent to each other. If this had simply been one contiguous patch of salt damage radiating outward from a single source of moisture, that pattern made little physical sense. Instead, the flagged regions were scattered, small, and crucially, each one carried the same handwriting-like statistical signature the model had learned from Leonardo's own notebooks. Confidence scores climbed as more data accumulated, not because the team adjusted the model to get the answer they wanted, but because more independent samples kept reinforcing the same classification. By the end of that week, the system's confidence in several of the flagged regions had risen into the low 80s. Still not proof. Still, in Kovac's own words during an internal meeting recorded that week, nowhere near enough to say anything publicly. But enough that Ferreira stopped joking about wall damage and started asking whether they had the computing budget to process the entire painting at this resolution. They did the math and realized they'd covered barely a tenth of the total surface. Whatever this was, if it was real, they were looking at a small fraction of it. The next phase moved faster because the team finally had a working hypothesis to test rather than a hunch to chase. Ferreira adjusted the model to specifically compare each flagged region against Leonardo's known mirrorscript letterforms, character by character, rather than treating the marks as unstructured texture. When individual letter shapes began aligning with statistically significant confidence, the team allowed themselves, cautiously, to start reading. The first cluster of characters, the one near Bartholomew, resolved into a short Latin fragment that translated roughly to what the eye refuses. It wasn't a complete sentence. It read more like a phrase pulled from the middle of something longer, a fragment whose other half was presumably still buried in an unprocessed section of the wall. The second cluster, near James, was clearer. Truth does not ask permission. The third, hidden in the folds beneath Philip's sleeve, was harder to parse and remains, even now, only a partial reconstruction, something closer to the many will look and the few will see. None of these fragments, on their own, meant much. Isabel Conti was the first to point out that isolated Latin phrases could be read into almost anything if you wanted them to mean something. Kovac agreed, and it's worth being honest here. At this stage, what the team had was a set of intriguing but disconnected pieces, not a message. That distinction mattered enormously to all three of them, and it's worth it mattering to us too. What changed the shape of the investigation wasn't any single phrase. It was a pattern Ferreira noticed almost by accident while trying to visualize where all the flagged regions sat relative to each other on the wall. When he plotted their coordinates, the points didn't scatter randomly. They traced a loose, expanding curve, beginning near the figure of Christ's right hand and sweeping outward across the table toward the disciples on the far side. When he measured the spacing between successive points, the ratios weren't uniform, but they weren't random either. They approximated, imperfectly but persistently, the same proportional relationships found in a logarithmic spiral, the kind of geometric structure Leonardo studied obsessively in shells, in water, in the architecture of plants. It's the same underlying mathematics behind what people often call the golden ratio, a proportion Leonardo used deliberately in multiple works, including his studies of human anatomy. This is the point where the team's internal skepticism started to genuinely erode, not because a spiral is inherently magical, but because it gave the disconnected phrases a plausible reason to be located exactly where they were. If someone wanted to hide a sequence of related ideas across a huge painted surface in a way that could later be reconstructed by someone who knew to look for a specific geometric key, a spiral radiating outward from the composition's visual center is precisely the kind of elegant, quietly arrogant solution Leonardo might have